It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the second Global Leaders Summit of the 7th World Investment Forum under the theme, International Production and Productive Capacity, National Strategies and Global Collaboration. My name is Jennifer Blanca, and I'm delighted to be here as the moderator of this important session. Yesterday morning, we heard from a number of government leaders about the strategies and policies that are being pursued to address the challenges to restarting the investment engine of growth in the post-pandemic era, to create a sustainable recovery, and to mobilize global investment to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. And yesterday afternoon, we heard some amazing examples of how the private sector is also stepping up to the plate, developing sustainable, inclusive solutions to make this world a better place. Today's summit will take up these issues from the perspective of the overriding transformative forces that the new industrial revolution and new technologies are bringing about. Now, just some of the issues we will discuss are, how is international production likely to be configured in 2030, and what challenges and opportunities are likely to arise from this? How can governments, the private sector, and the international community best prepare economies to take advantage of the opportunities for development that are emanating from the changing international production landscape, and to counter the main challenges? And what can the United Nations do to support these efforts? We're delighted to have so many people listening to today's Global Leaders Summit. As you might have already gathered, this is the first World Investment Summit that is fully online as we adjust to our new reality, keeping everyone safe as well as keeping carbon emissions down, since we're not traveling. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers for this session today, and let me tell you who they are. Ms. Rebecca Greenspan, Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. His Excellency, Mr. Mustafa Mabuli, Prime Minister of Egypt. His Excellency, Mr. Bisher Al-Khaznawi, Prime Minister of Jordan. His Excellency, Mr. Aziz Askanoush, Head of Government of the Kingdom of Morocco. His Excellency, Mr. Imran Khan, Prime Minister of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. Mr. Birger Brende, President of the World Economic Forum. Mr. Peter Robinson, President and CEO of the United States Council for International Business. Professor Jeffrey Sachs, Director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. Mr. Roberto Marcus, Executive Chairman and Group CEO of Natura & Co. in Brazil. And Mr. Hans-Paul Birkner, Global Chairman of the Emeritus of the Boston Consulting Group. We have about 2 hours, and we're going to hear from all these high-level speakers to help shed light on the critical topics at hand. Hence, without further ado, it is my great pleasure and honor to invite the first panelist and our host for this important session, Ms. Rebecca Greenspan, Secretary General, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Secretary General, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jennifer. This is really a fantastic panel. So let me greet the prime ministers and heads of government that are with us today, as well as all the other very important panelists. Excellencies, esteemed delegates, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. It is my pleasure to open this dialogue with such distinguished panelists. Thank you all for being here today. It really is such an honor. In my opening address yesterday, I spoke of the 3 post-pandemic challenges facing the global investment community. And I repeat, first, the direction of industrial development and the global value chains in international production. 2, investment and infrastructure. 3, investment and SDGs. Today, I would like to use my remarks to elaborate on the first of these challenges, global value chains and international production, the theme of this Global Leaders Summit. This topic is producing many headlines at the moment. Global production has never been this stressed. There are bottlenecks almost everywhere one looks. Cars in Germany are waiting for chips coming from South Korea. South Korean factories are waiting for ships stranded in the American West Coast. Low vaccination rates and sudden weather events are closing major manufacturing centers in places like China and Vietnam. while consumers in highly vaccinated advanced economies are spending in record amounts. Lastly, shipping costs are skyrocketing, growing about 5 times relative to pre-COVID levels. In short, an uneven two-speed global recovery is producing a major mismatch in the demand and supply of global production. One reason behind this mismatch is, as I mentioned, that the demand is coming from countries with vaccines and huge fiscal packages, while part of the supply is coming from countries for whom this pandemic is not yet over and who lack the fiscal firepower to restart in full steam. Much depends on how global production reacts to these events on the long term. But in the meantime, we have the added risk of generating inflation across the board. But to answer this question, to understand what will happen to international production, it is important to also see what was happening in global value chains before the pandemic and what are the structural megatrends behind this phenomenon. I would highlight 3 of these megatrends. You have referred to them, Jennifer, in your initial remarks. First, technological change. This includes not only more digital work patterns, something we all witnessed during this pandemic, but also major advancements such as robotic-enabled automation, enhanced supply chain digitalization, and additive manufacturing. How these innovations affect global value chains will depend on the second megatrend, mounting geopolitics. Rising interventionism and protectionism are producing a shift away from multilateral to regional and bilateral frameworks. This is leading to the reshoring, nearshoring of production. Why? The answer and the key word here is resilience, which this pandemic has highlighted. In a context of trade tensions and weather events, producers want to maximize diversification as opposed to just minimize labor costs. The last megatrend in the green transition and the rapid growth in sustainability-linked investments that actually are bypassing the developing countries, these are creating new demands which have geographical and regulatory implications in terms of both the what and the how of production, as well as the how far of it will transportation also take a part of it. The effect of international production of these 3 megatrends, technology, geopolitics, and sustainability, are complex. They are at times mutually reinforcing, at times mutually polarizing, and they are playing out differently across industries and geographies. But in general, they tend to favor one of 4 trajectories: the reshoring, nearshoring of production, the diversification into new industries, the regionalization of production and sales, and the rebundling of production stages. This is therefore the panorama that we face. The key question now is what we should do about it, considering how important international production is for the post-pandemic recovery. According to our research at UNCTAD, to confront these challenges, we need to change the investment development paradigm. These include, first, a shift of focus from export-oriented efficiency-seeking investments in narrow global value chain segments to an export plus focus. That is, export plus investment in regional markets plus investment in a broader industrial base. Second, a shift of focus from cost-based competition for single location investors to competition for diversified investment based on flexibility and resilience. And three, and lastly, a shift of focus from big infrastructure to lean infrastructure. Ladies and gentlemen, before I finish, I would like to say one thing about industrial planning, which will be greatly affected by all that I have just mentioned. As you might have seen, I have focused my remarks on investment in international production and industry. This focus on industry rather than infrastructure is deliberate. Recovery investment plans in most countries focus on infrastructure sectors, including physical, digital, and green infrastructure. These are sound investments that are, of course, needed. But it is important we see beyond infrastructure and into industry. Investment in industry, both manufacturing and services, was hit much harder by the pandemic than investment in infrastructure. A slow recovery of investment in industrial sectors, in which foreign direct investment often plays a more important role, will put a brake on productive capacity growth. UNCTAD's latest data show that in the first 6 months of this year, international project financing infrastructure is already growing at a brisk pace. But greenfield investment in industry is still in the decline. For developing countries in particular, initiatives to promote new investments in industry will be important to complement recovery effort and produce structural change. Great transformations require great investments, and great investments require broad perspective. Is it therefore very important to consider all the megatrends, trajectories, and paradigm shifts I have just presented to you? But I don't want to take much more time from the experts in the panel who clearly have much to talk about in these sessions, but only emphasize that we are in a divergent path in the recovery. We are not building back together, and we are not building back differently. If we continue on that path, the recovery will be fragile and will bring more and widen the inequalities and asymmetries that we already have in the world. So let's take this seriously. Let's try to build back differently and together to change this trajectory. Thank you very much, Jennifer. I thank you all.
Thank you, Secretary General, for highlighting the worrisome imbalances and the great challenges that are facing the world of investment and what needs to be done differently and together so that investments are harnessed for resilience and sustainable development, and also for setting out our challenge, the challenge ahead of us today. Now we will turn to hear from government officials on how they are approaching their own national investment strategies to this end. Our first speaker is the President of Indonesia, His Excellency Mr. Joko Widodo. Please, Your Excellency.
His Excellency, Madam Rebecca Greenspan, Sekretaris Jenderal UNCTAD, dan yang mulia para delegasi yang terhormat serta hadirin yang saya hormati. Pandemi COVID-19 yang telah kita lalui bersama melanda hampir semua belahan dunia. Yang diawali dari persoalan kesehatan yang berdampak pada persoalan ekonomi, bahkan persoalan sosial. Hampir semua negara hari ini sedang melakukan konsolidasi internal untuk bagaimana bisa menyelesaikan persoalan pandemi COVID-19 ini. Pertumbuhan ekonomi global dipengaruhi dengan persoalan kesehatan. Dan oleh karena itu, tidak ada cara lain. Salah satu di antaranya adalah ketika pertumbuhan ekonomi global mulai berpengaruh pada kesehatan, maka salah satu instrumen untuk mempertahankan adalah investasi. Kebijakan ekonomi pemerintah Indonesia telah mengadopsi pembangunan berkelanjutan sebagai arus utama pada arah kebijakan pembangunan yang tercermin dalam prioritas pembangunan yang berfokus pada ekosistem investasi dan kolaborasi di dunia. Usaha untuk memperkuat perkembangan ekonomi berbasis inovasi dan teknologi, khususnya ke arah ekonomi hijau dan ekonomi biru yang berkelanjutan. Perbaikan manajemen pembangunan yang mendapatkan pembangunan berkelanjutan. Pada perspektif yang lain, kami mempunyai pilar pembangunan berkelanjutan. Di antaranya adalah ekonomi yang saling menguntungkan, berdampak sosial secara positif dan ramah lingkungan. Sebab tidak ada artinya sebuah pembangunan ekonomi lahir di sebuah negara tanpa ada saling menguntungkan. Sosial harus tetap kita jadikan sebagai salah satu garda terdepan untuk mendorong kesejahteraan. Dan lingkungan adalah merupakan faktor utama sebagai penentu untuk membangun investasi yang berkelanjutan. Pada konteks itu, mewujudkan keadilan stabilitas investasi yang dikedepankan sebagai tulang punggung ekonomi adalah investasi yang inklusif dengan mencirikan pada 5 pilar. Yang pertama adalah bagaimana meningkatkan partisipasi publik. Partisipasi publik harus dijadikan sebagian instrumen terpenting untuk menjadikan publik sebagai subjek dan objek pembangunan ekonomi di mana investasi itu berada. Melestarikan ekologi, memantapkan stabilitas, memaksimalkan pemanfaatan teknologi, dan menjamin kontinuitas. Sebab suatu produk akan bisa berjalan dengan baik tergantung dari seberapa besar kontinuitasnya bisa berlanjut. Teknologi merupakan bagian yang juga harus dipikirkan bersama-sama. Pada konteks itulah kemudian kami mencontohkan di Indonesia. Di Indonesia hari ini sedang mendorong suatu program investasi yang ramah lingkungan dan yang berkelanjutan. Di mana kami sedang membuat suatu kebijakan untuk membangun industri baterai dari hulu ke hilir. Kami memulai dari persoalan mining, smelter, prekursor, cathode, sampai dengan baterai sel, sampai dengan recycle-nya. Ini adalah bagian yang kami harus sampaikan dengan mempergunakan energi baru terbarukan, dengan tetap memperhatikan lingkungan. Inilah yang kami maksudkan sebagai satu ekosistem yang satu dengan lainnya bisa berjalan. Di aspek yang lain kita tahu bersama bahwa pandemi COVID-19 ini betul-betul membawa kita kepada arus baru. Sebagian negara menganggap COVID-19 ini adalah sebuah masalah. Tapi sebagian negara juga menganggap bahwa ini adalah sebuah peluang. Kami di Indonesia menganggap ini sekalipun di sisi lain ada masalah, tapi juga di sisi lain adalah peluang. Kenapa kami mengatakan sebagai peluang? Karena inilah waktu, timing yang tepat untuk melakukan introspeksi internal dengan melakukan berbagai macam strategi untuk tetap mempertahankan pertumbuhan ekonomi nasional stabil lewat investasi. Contoh, kami di Indonesia sekarang telah melakukan reform terhadap berbagai regulasi yang tumpang tindih yang mendorong agar terciptanya kepastian, kecepatan, dan transparansi bagi pelaku usaha di negara kami. Kami juga ingin memperlihatkan bahwa melakukan konsolidasi secara masif terhadap kekuatan ekonomi domestik. Tapi di sisi yang lain juga kami ingin mengatakan dan ingin menawarkan konsep untuk melakukan sebuah aktivitas ekonomi di Indonesia dengan nyaman dan penuh dengan kepastian. COVID harus kita hadapi bersama. Oleh karena itu, dalam perspektif kami untuk melakukan investasi ke depan yang lebih baik, maka harus kita melakukan kolaborasi bersama. Tidak akan mungkin kita bisa bekerja sendiri. Kolaborasi adalah sebagai bentuk perwujudan dari saling bekerja sama, saling menguatkan dan meningkatkan daya saing antara negara-negara. Indonesia menawarkan sebuah konsep yang tetap saling menghargai dan menjunjung tinggi terhadap kebijakan masing-masing negara. Sebab di setiap negara mempunyai cara, strategi yang berbeda-beda berdasarkan kultur, berdasarkan geografis, berdasarkan sumber daya alam. Salah satu contoh kami menawarkan di investasi di Indonesia khususnya dalam rangka hilirisasi sumber daya alam. Kami ingin memberikan kontribusi yang maksimal kepada dunia, khususnya untuk mendukung emisi, khususnya untuk mendorong meninggalkan fosil untuk masuk kepada energi baru terbarukan. Dengan seperti saya katakan di awal, membangun industri pabrik baterai di dunia. Kami melarang untuk mengekspor ore nikel sebagai bentuk proteksi Indonesia kepada dunia dalam konteks bagaimana menjaga ekosistem dan lingkungan dan harus mendorong kepada energi baru terbarukan. Oleh karena itu, kami ingin sesuatu produk yang kami kirim atau kami ekspor ke dunia itu sudah mencapai 70% hilirisasinya. Ini adalah sebagai bentuk komitmen pemerintah Indonesia dalam mendorong dan menjaga ekosistem lingkungan dan energi baru terbarukan. Di aspek yang lain juga kami ingin menawarkan bahwa harus ada satu kesepahaman untuk berdiri sama tinggi dan duduk sama rendah. Sebagai bentuk penghargaan sesama antar negara. Kalau ini mampu kita lakukan, maka saya yakin dunia ke depan akan semakin berdaya saing tinggi dengan saling menghargai dan memberikan kontribusi terbaiknya kepada dunia, bangsa, dan negara masing-masing. Tahun depan Indonesia akan menjadi ketua G20. Sehingga Indonesia memiliki andil yang cukup penting dalam rangka mewujudkan agenda bersama yang mengedepankan aspek pembangunan yang berkelanjutan. Kami di bawah pemerintahan Bapak Presiden Joko Widodo telah memberikan arahan yang jelas bahwa seluruh investasi yang dibangun ke depan harus pertama memperhatikan dan menjaga kesinambungan daripada lingkungan. Yang kedua adalah emisi karbon harus betul-betul diperhatikan untuk bagaimana menjaga iklim dunia. Dan yang ketiga adalah bagaimana mendorong kolaborasi yang baik, teknologi yang baik, kemudian masyarakat, dan sudah bertentu saling menguntungkan kesemuanya. Saya pikir ini beberapa hal yang perlu saya tawarkan pada forum yang terhormat ini. Terima kasih.
We thank you, Your Excellency, Mr. Bahlil Lahadalia. Minister of Investment of the Republic of Indonesia, for delivering the message on behalf of the President of Indonesia and reinforcing the importance of ensuring both inclusive and green growth as we build back better. And also that every crisis is an opportunity for doing things differently if we seize it. We certainly look forward to your G20 presidency of sustainable development that you have described. Our next speaker is His Excellency Mr. Mustafa Mabuli, Prime Minister of Egypt.
Excellency Rebecca Greenspan, Secretary General of UNCTAD, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great honor for me to join you for this Global Leaders Investment Summit and to deliver this message on behalf of His Excellency, the Prime Minister of Egypt, who was keen to join us, but unfortunately had an unforeseen work commitment. With less than 10 years left to implement the 2030 Agenda, it is vital for the global community to address the new worldwide production environment that has dramatically changed and is interlinked with plans for sustainable recovery and the realization of the SDGs. The COVID-19 pandemic has already weighed heavily on Africa. UNCTAD estimates show that recovery in Africa will cost some $150 billion. That's on top of the pre-existing annual SDG finance gap in Africa of around $200 billion. No country can address these challenges alone, but this summit offers an opportunity to consolidate national strategies and global cooperation to discuss how to improve our productive capacities. Egypt has been fully committed to undertake an ambitious, comprehensive, and transparent economic reform program, which tackles the economic, monetary, and legislative challenges and focuses on enhancing investment and the business environment. The program adopted by the government in 2016 contributed to improving all the economic indicators and enhancing the resilience of the Egyptian economy. This has been reflected by high GDP growth, the primary deficit turning into a surplus, and both inflation and unemployment dropping from double to single digits. The program also gave the fiscal space needed to withstand the economic, social, and health repercussions of the pandemic, making Egypt one of very few countries to achieve positive economic growth amid the pandemic. I'm also proud to state that Egypt's investment policy has developed immensely, and Egypt has remained the largest recipient of FDI in Africa last year, despite the slowdown in the global economy and the decline in global FDI flows. Ladies and gentlemen, we have demonstrated during this year that the challenges posed by the pandemic would not stop us from advancing our progress, but rather increase our determination to move forward on reform and sustainable recovery. This year, the government has pursued a second phase of economic reforms, launching the 3-year National Structural Reform Program, which entails well-targeted reforms at the structural and legal levels, targeting the real sector and centered on enhancing the business climate with goals of stimulating investments in productive, job-creating industries. It focuses on diversifying the productive structures of 3 main priority sectors, namely industry, agriculture, and communication and information technology, with an aim to achieve sustainable growth and to create decent and productive work opportunities in line with SDG 8. By the same token, Egypt lays great emphasis on the localization of manufacturing activities in some of the industries, including pharmaceuticals, agriculture, industrialization, telecommunication, products, transportation requirements, home appliances, and furniture industry. Through further expansions in the construction of industrial zones, we are capitalizing on the changes in the global supply chains to access new markets in which Egyptian products enjoy competitive advantages. Ladies and gentlemen, as we reiterate our determination towards this year's forum theme on investment in sustainable development, the Egyptian government is accelerating green-driven recovery and climate action that puts nature at its heart and ensures equitable benefit to all economic sectors. There is a clear vision for the integration of environmental dimensions in the Egyptian development budget by investing in green projects such as tertiary treatment sewage projects, renewable energy, and sustainable transport, with 30% of the government's current investment plan covering green projects, and a target to increase the ratio to 50% by the fiscal year 24-25. The government of Egypt has also recently launched the environmental sustainability criteria to measure progress in the financing of activities having a positive impact on the environment, not only for government agencies, but also for the private sector. Ladies and gentlemen, the world today depends critically on partnerships and international cooperation that is made possible by institutions such as UNCTAD. The government of Egypt has capitalized on effective partnerships with the private sector, most notably through the recently created Sovereign Fund of Egypt, intended to boost productivity, tap into global value chains, and provide knowledge-sharing opportunities, augmenting the share of the private sector in the economy and in carrying out impact investment. Egypt has also engaged actively in the UN system activities in collaboration with UNCTAD and other UN organizations. The government of Egypt is implementing a joint project with the UN resident coordinator in Egypt on Egypt SDGs financing strategy. The sectors covered by this project include education, health, water, sanitation, and transportation. We believe that only together we will be able to unlock the pathway towards a fully fledged rapid economic recovery, offering boundless opportunities for our people. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Dr. Hala El Said, Minister of Planning and Economic Development of the Arab Republic of Egypt, for delivering that message on behalf of the Prime Minister of Egypt. Thank you for reiterating Egypt's commitment to global cooperation efforts and the importance of inclusive green growth, and also focusing on job-rich sectors, something that's often forgotten. Our next speaker is His Excellency, Mr. Bisher Al-Kazanwe, Prime Minister of Jordan.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be part of the 7th World Investment Forum and to be addressing you on behalf of His Excellency, the Prime Minister of Jordan, Dr. Bisher Al-Kazanwe. The UNCTAD has always been an advocate for trade, investment, finance, and technology as vehicles for inclusive and sustainable development. Today's Global Investment Conference sets a promising tone for strengthening our cooperation to support global economic recovery. However, the ever-changing dynamics of the coronavirus continues to surprise people across the globe. The pandemic is still very much affecting how we work and live, and we are still trying to collectively understand how it will shape our future. Since early last year, our efforts were focused not only on containing the pandemic and protecting the lives of our people, but also on mitigating the economic impact of the pandemic and its repercussions on livelihoods, economic sectors, and activities. Hence today, we are all struggling to set paths for economic recovery. Recovery that is sustainable, inclusive, and resilient, and a recovery that fosters our transition to meet our future aspirations. Nevertheless, I believe that we have been given another opportunity to think of global systems for investment, trade, and supply chains from a new perspective, as well as put forward policy agendas that better harness the potential of new technologies in spurring further innovation and growth. In Jordan, the biggest challenges we face today are related to unemployment and stimulating equitable economic growth. Our recently adopted Economic Priorities Program for the years 2021-2023 seeks to enable the private sector to create new jobs, stimulate local and foreign investments, and expand our export potential in regional and international markets. Moreover, we are continuing with the implementation of our structural and economic reform agenda with more emphasis on improving the investment and doing business environment in Jordan. We are also adopting progressive policies to broaden access to opportunities that come from technological change and advancement. Leveraging digitization is a key driver and enabler for inclusive and equitable economic recovery. Moreover, expanding regional and global cooperation is also a key pillar of our economic recovery framework. Jordan has been actively exploring new venues and means to increase and restore greater cooperation among countries within the region towards better prospects for regional connectivity and economic integration. In closing, I would like to thank UNCTAD for giving me the opportunity to address this important forum, which I believe it can contribute towards a new era of globalization that seeks a sustainable and green recovery, as well as puts the well-being of our peoples and our planet first. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Mr. Nasser Shraideh, Minister of Planning and International Cooperation, for delivering the message on behalf of the Prime Minister of Jordan and reinforcing the importance of regional and global cooperation to drive sustainable development. Our next speaker is His Excellency, Mr. Aziz Akanouch, Head of Government of the Kingdom of Morocco.
Madame Rebecca Greenspan, secrétaire générale de la Conférence des Nations Unies sur le commerce et le développement, Mesdames et Messieurs les ministres, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, je suis ravi de prendre part, au nom du chef du gouvernement du Royaume du Maroc, à cette 7e édition du Forum mondial de l'investissement. Je voudrais remercier à cet effet Madame Rebecca Greenspan, secrétaire générale de la CNUSED, d'avoir invité le Royaume du Maroc à participer à ce sommet des leaders mondiaux de l'investissement. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, la pandémie de la COVID-19 a provoqué l'arrêt brutal de nos chaînes de valeur et nous a entraînés dans une récession économique. La baisse notable des IDE de près de 35% entre 2019 et 2020 en est un exemple frappant. L'impact a été global et multidimensionnel. Et au-delà du choc sanitaire et économique, cette pandémie a révélé la fragilité de nos systèmes. Elle a mis en évidence certaines vulnérabilités structurelles et des insuffisances au niveau des politiques publiques. Conscient de ces bouleversements, le Royaume du Maroc a déployé tous ses efforts pour faire face à cette crise. Dès les premiers jours et sur instruction de Sa Majesté le roi Mohamed VI, le Maroc a créé un fonds spécial Covid-19 doté de plus de 3 milliards d'euros. Le Maroc a aussi travaillé pour la mise en place d'un plan de relance économique ambitieux doté de 12 milliards d'euros, soit 11% du PIB marocain. Dans le
economic revitalization program. In response, following the direct recommendation by the King, Morocco also helped provide medical supplies to more than 20 African countries. And this made in Morocco medical equipment was produced thanks to Morocco's industry's rapid adjustment to the pandemic, and it was shipped through our national air carrier. The King also presided over signing ceremonies in order to try and launch the production of vaccines in Morocco with a view to developing in the long run the active substances and promoting greater R&D in this field. Ladies and gentlemen, the summit that brings us here today is of particular importance. It is taking place at a time when the world is beginning to glimpse the possibility of a way out of the crisis. And it also provides opportunity to look at how we can achieve the difficult challenge of sustainable development and economic recovery. Therefore, we know that investments geared towards renewable energy, sustainable transport, mobility, and decarbonized industries offer very interesting yields and help create more skilled jobs. Morocco's dedication to an inclusive and sustainable form of development is clear. We have been very aware of the climate challenges from a very early day, and we are pioneers in terms of environmental safeguards. Between 2011 and 2018, we have invested a great deal in these fields, and our nationally determined contributions are aligned on the 1.5-degree rise as contained in the Paris Agreement. We have focused on energy efficiency and countering climate change. We have a major water and solar power project, which involves more than 2 billion euros of investment. And this is part of our strategic investment plan, which aims to provide a much higher share of renewable electricity by 2030. In order to rise to the challenge of these environmental and energy challenges, Morocco has also launched our national water program, a green plan for agriculture, a national strategy for planning and development of oases, and a fishing plan. This commitment for an inclusive and sustainable form of development needs to be the commitment of everyone. That is why Morocco wanted to share its experience with other African states. And Morocco is behind a number of continent-wide initiatives, such as the SSS Water for Africa, the Blue Belt, the Marrakesh Global Partnership for Renewable Energies, and the AAA initiative for the adaptation of Africa's agriculture to climate change. The hosting in Marrakesh of the first African summit on the fringes of the COP22 helped adopt 3 African climate conventions. Ladies and gentlemen, we're at a critical juncture. The global economy is going to undergo several changes. The pandemic has also reminded us of how important it is to be better prepared to shocks and to have resilient economies. Morocco has therefore rethought its development model with a view to placing citizens at its heart and ensuring that resources are used in a sustainable way and that our territories are used in a rational manner. We also aim to establish an economy that creates added value and is innovative and provides good return on investment. I would like to remind you that Morocco has a lot of assets which can help it take an active part in this global push towards a more inclusive and diversified global economy, and it is strategically situated geographically between Europe and Africa. And Morocco has a great potential when it comes to renewable energies. It also has an investment-friendly regulatory framework. It is deeply anchored in Africa, and it offers an open-looking economy geared towards the international stage. Thank you.
Mr. Mohsin Jazuli, to the head of government in charge of investment, convergence, and evaluation of public policies for delivering the message on behalf of the head of government of Morocco and sharing the important development efforts that your government is making both at home and on the continent of Africa. It's well appreciated. Our next speaker is His Excellency, Mr. Imran Khan, Prime Minister of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Prime Minister Imran Khan, I commend UN Conference on Trade and Development for pioneering this important global forum. Investment is obviously a key enabler of economic growth and development, especially in developing countries. FDI inflows are perhaps more necessary now than ever. They have a critical role in global economic recovery from the devastating effects of the COVID pandemic. For developing countries like Pakistan, we often reflect on this puzzle, where on the one hand, there is a huge demand for infrastructure, energy, and human development, yet there are significant constraints on the supply side. We know there is annual $4 trillion shortfall in meeting the sustainable development goals across the world. There is abundance of international finance available, both from private and public sources that can be deployed. We also know that international investments can fetch between 10 to 12% rates of return. and the issue of impact of investments is a key consideration. The challenge is how to bridge this gap between demand and supply on the one hand, and to ensure good returns and create impact on the other. Let me make 4 suggestions. First is the issue of de-risking. Investors require legitimate guarantees to mitigate risks and secure reasonable returns. I propose deployment of public finance as a means to de-risk private investments. In doing so, we should prioritize investment flows to areas aligned with SDGs. Working together, multilateral development banks, including World Bank, Asian Development Bank, development aid agencies, and private sector, can play a major role to mitigate potential risks. Such a shift in approach can create huge impact in terms of human development, poverty alleviation, public health, education, jobs, and livelihoods. Second is the issue of credit rating. Currently, the global credit rating agencies have a short-term horizon of 1 year to determine sovereign ratings. This is too short a time frame. It is a handicap for developing countries. This needs to change to a more long-term horizon to allow for a more reasonable sovereign rating mechanism. Third, the issue of dispute resolution. There are over 20,000 international investment agreements, many of which have encountered disputes between investors and states. I propose revisiting the present approach with a special focus on reforming the investor-state dispute resolution mechanism. I would also suggest placement of moratorium on claims that may arise due to the pandemic-induced investment disputes. UNCTAD has done commendable work to reform international investment agreements, including dispute resolution mechanism. Their proposals deserve serious consideration. Finally, the issue of sustainable infrastructure. Pakistan has proposed an integrated sustainable infrastructure facility under the UN umbrella. The idea is for this facility to harmonize investment policies, provide assistance to developing countries for preparation of project and feasibility studies, and to access financing both from public and private sources. The required $1.5 trillion annual investment in sustainable infrastructure can and must be mobilized. I take this opportunity to reiterate the proposal on sustainable infrastructure facility. Excellencies, of course, as recipients of investment flows, developing countries need to provide an enabling investment environment and a regulatory framework that is fair and balanced. The PTI government, under the leadership of Prime Minister Imran Khan, has made progress on the investment front. Pakistan has been ranked among the top 10 improvers in the World Bank's Doing Business Report 2020. Pakistan is home to more than 1,000 foreign companies. In terms of alignment with SDGs, the government has issued green bonds. We are exploring options to swap debt for environmental protection-related projects. We are setting up special economic zones and technology parks. I, on behalf of the Prime Minister, would like to invite global investors to avail a range of investment opportunities in infrastructure, energy, agriculture, communications, technology, and other areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Mr. Hamad Azhar, Minister of Energy of Pakistan, for delivering the message on behalf of the Prime Minister of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan and reinforcing to all of us the importance of good enabling environments and frameworks for impact investment, particularly for building sustainable infrastructure. We will now be shifting gears a bit and we'll be bringing in some non-governmental voices to weigh in with their perspectives on challenges and strategies, starting with Mr. Birger Brende, President of the World Economic Forum. Birger.
It is such a pleasure to be with you today at the Global Leaders Investment Summit. Thank you to UNCTAD for the invitation and for the close collaboration between our organizations. A lot has changed since I had the pleasure to speak at the same summit 3 years ago in person here in Geneva. At that time, we were already facing challenges to global investment, but we could not have imagined what was to come with the pandemic. I'm sure you all know that the foreign direct investments, FDI, fell by 35% globally in 2020. Thankfully, we are starting to see recovery. Recent data show that global mergers and acquisitions reached $3.6 trillion in the first half of 2021, surpassing the level of deal-making in all of 2020. This is not completely surprising, as we know trillions of dollars of capital has been looking for productive investments. What is worrying, though, is that this capital is not flowing where it is most needed. For instance, FDI into infrastructure in developing countries is down still by 54%. Yet we know infrastructure is a crucial enabler for long-term sustainable growth and can provide reliable returns. This is why global cooperation on investment for development is so crucial. Only a truly multi-stakeholder approach, bringing together governments, international organizations, business leaders, and the civil society can help sustainable capital flow to where it is most needed. And the moment to cooperate is now. A few days ago, I met with my friend Dr. Ngozi at the WTO to deliver a call to action that was signed by over 30 CEOs. These business leaders made clear that investment has the potential to drive a sustainable recovery. Really, there will be no recovery without the investment recovery, including in emerging markets and developing countries. But these leaders stressed government action is crucial to facilitating this investment and making it a reality. The message is clear. We need business and government to work together in developing the right investment tools and in putting these tools into practice. Which is why I'm so pleased that in a session yesterday, we discussed launching a new World Investment for Development Alliance. Leaders from international organizations, business, governments, and civil society are planning to come together to facilitate global cooperation on investment, including through considering how to align efforts and develop joint activities. These activities can help identify and operationalize the right tools to grow sustainable investment, really walking the talk. Our discussion yesterday and dialogue throughout the World Investment Forum this week show there is much support. This makes me so confident that we are on the right path. Just imagine how much the trade facilitation has meant. Let's now facilitate also investments moving forward. Because through public-private cooperation, investment can help tie together our economies, making them stronger and more resilient. Global investment can be the engine that helps us reach our aim of sustainable prosperity. And it can even fuel peace, because interwoven economic relationships see less conflict and more stability. I really look forward to working with all of you on ensuring investment that can drive an inclusive, sustainable, dynamic, and long-term recovery. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Børge. Thank you, Mr. Brende, for reminding us about the importance of ensuring that capital doesn't just flow, but that it flows where it is most needed for sustainable development, as well as how multi-stakeholder dialogue can be harnessed to make this happen. And we have heard your call to action. We now have the pleasure of welcoming Mr. Peter Robinson, President and CEO of the United States Council for International Business, to hear about his agenda from an international business perspective. Mr. Robinson, could you please share with us your thoughts on, sort of the production and investment landscape today, sustainable development, how you see things playing out and what needs to be done?
Thanks very much, Jennifer, and thank you, Secretary General Greenspan, for the opportunity to participate today. My organization, USCIB, is one that represents US-based global companies and professional services firms for most sectors of our economy and from every region of the world. We have greatly valued our cooperation with UNCTAD in the investment policy area. UNCTAD's Enterprise Division Director, James Zahn, and his team continue to do some very valuable work. Indeed, in our view, UNCTAD has become the go-to organization for statistics and trends on international investment flows and in cataloging the key provisions in the global network of over 3,000 international investment agreements. USCIB serves as the US affiliate of the International Chamber of Commerce, the International Organization of Employers, and Business at OECD, a unique global network through which we provide business views to policymakers and regulatory authorities worldwide to facilitate trade and investment. We've also had the honor to take part as a private sector representative in various UN bodies, including as official observer to ECOSOC and as lead business representative in the UN Commission on International Trade Law, UNCITRAL, Working Group 3, considering possible reforms to the investor-state dispute settlement arbitration mechanism. As a longstanding voice for the U.S. private sector on international investment policy issues, I just echo some of the comments made already. I can't underscore how important foreign direct investment is to the world, especially today. According to both UNCTAD and OECD, since the onset of COVID-19, global foreign direct investment flows have decreased by 38% in 2020 to their lowest level since 2005. Projections indicate a relatively modest recovery in global FDI for 2021, but this is happening in a time of great need. The negative economic impacts of COVID continue to plague world economies, but nowhere more than in the developing world, where there is scant access to vaccines and to the resources necessary for sustainable recovery. The pandemic has exacerbated the investment gap, and the developing world is most at risk. Although the OECD expects most of the resource-rich developed economies to recover by the end of this year, UNCTAD reports that recovery in many developing economies might take more than 5 years. So this is a sign of the divergent path that Secretary General Greenspan mentioned earlier. While the solution to pandemic recovery is certainly multifaceted, foreign direct investment is a key component. It's now important than ever that international organizations like the UN and its member governments around the world provide the necessary welcoming environment for FDI in quality industry and infrastructure projects that help with pandemic relief and sustainable economic growth. This includes developing enabling environments for urgently needed investments in 1, health infrastructure, as well as in life sciences and health innovation. 2, green energy transitions and circular economy to help the world achieve goals outlined in the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. And thirdly, the information and communications technology sector to bridge the digital divide and keep people and businesses connected and productive during future challenges like pandemics. So we ask that the UN, international institutions, and nation states, 1, engage closely with industry in a public-private partnership to learn about the barriers we face to investments in developing countries. Secondly, promote the standards and tools outlined in the OECD Declaration on International Investments and Multinational Enterprises, the Policy Framework for Investment, and the Anti-Bribery Convention and other formal instruments that will improve the investment climate and facilitate business operations overseas. Thirdly, defend a rules-based trade and investment system, including the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, which safeguards investor rights, particularly when investing in riskier markets. And fourthly, we reject measures that serve merely to deter investment, including a proliferation of investment screening mechanisms and unnecessary restrictions on supply chains. I'm convinced that the American and international business communities can play a vital role in increasing the quantity and quality of FDI flows around the world, creating economic growth and jobs, and supporting the UN SDGs. We are the people who actually invest and who make investment real. We want to be part of the discussion and debate about investment policy issues, whether in UNCTAD, UNCITRAL, at the OECD, or elsewhere. We want to listen, to learn, and to offer our views and solutions. UN Secretary General Guterres has asserted that nations need to turn the recovery into a real opportunity to do things right for the future, support for a strong investment climate to address the economic challenges of today will go a long way in achieving that vision. Thanks again for the privilege of presenting some views today. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mr. Robinson, for painting such a clear picture of which sectors and actions are most critical, really, for driving trade and investment. It's certainly, it's an agenda ahead. And I think we have the right people around the table today to have the conversation about what needs to be done. Now I have the honor of welcoming Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who's the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. Professor Sachs, from your point of view, what must we all be keeping in mind as we aim to build back from this crisis?
Thank you very much. Well, I really have a different point of view from most of the speakers. Most of what's been said so far is the idea that if we just unleash private investment, all will be well. This is like pounding our head against the wall again and again and again for the last 25 years. The private sector will not save the developing countries from what is happening right now, which is catastrophic. Governments need to invest. They need to invest in education. They need to invest in healthcare. They need to invest in their children. They need to invest in urban infrastructure. Not all of this, and most of it, in fact, cannot be packaged as private investment. Private investment is fine for business, but that's only 1/3 of the kinds of investments we need. The most important investments in any society are in human capital, in health, in nutrition, and in education. And the situation is disastrous in those countries, in the poor countries, because they do not have the financing in their budgets. They do not have the means in order to provide the most basic human capital investments. The second kind of investment is infrastructure, but much of that is not commercializable. Much of it is environmental protection. Much of it is adaptation to the disastrous climate changes that are imposed on poor countries by the rich country greenhouse gas emissions. The third category is business investment, and that's where the CEO should stick to their lane. And they should also learn something about development, actually, because we have so many forums that wave trillions and trillions of dollars and say, if just the poor countries would just get out of the way and ease the business environment and do this and do that. And we've got so many alliances, and capital's a force for good. And it's so much malarkey, actually, because we're not looking at the basic budgetary needs of poor people and poor countries who are hungry, whose children are not in school, who don't have access to the most basic non-commercializable infrastructure. So my point is something quite different from most of what has been said. First, we have two sets of goals. We have 17 sustainable development goals to the year 2030, and we have the Paris decarbonization requirement to mid-century. First, let us plan quantitatively, not in this kind of rhetoric and poetry of the beauty of the market, but plan the investments that are needed in human capital, in infrastructure.
I think that we perhaps have lost Professor Sachs for a moment. Okay, so we will move on, but I think we have a good sense of where Professor Sachs was going, reminding everyone that the investments that governments must make to create the underlying physical and especially human capital needed to develop sustainably, we cannot forget about that. It's not all about business stepping up to the plate. It's about everybody sort of coming in and doing what is needed. So this is an excellent segue, I think, into our last two speakers who both represent leading companies. First, we will hear from Mr. Roberto Marcus, who's the executive chairman and group CEO of Natura & Co. Of Brazil, a sustainable enterprise. And after that, we will hear from Hans Paul Berkner, who is the global chair emeritus of the Boston Consultant Group. So, Mr. Marquez, let me turn to you first. How has your company been navigating the great changes underway? And if you'd like, you can maybe comment a little bit on what Professor Sachs was saying in terms of what you need and what sorts of investments you can actually be making. Over to you.
Thank you. And first and foremost, again, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. So just a little bit of background on Natura & Co. Natura & Co. is a family of four actually very purpose-driven businesses: Avon, Natura, The Body Shop, and Aesop. And while each of those brands has a unique story, we united together on one common purpose, which is to really nurture beauty and relationship for a better way of living and doing business. For us, it hasn't been just about products. It's about how products can actually help empower people, deepen relationships, and ultimately enhance well-being. We are no doubt about it living in a technology renaissance, and it is really important that technology can actually be used to empower humanity in a unprecedented way. And I think Professor, was talking a little bit about how we can actually funnel technology and resources to help humanity in a way that can equip us to make actually instrumental changes in the way we think about, running business and doing business, especially in many of the developing markets. Natura & Co is rooted in Brazil, is a Brazilian company, has a strong presence in developing markets. And we also believe that, the world doesn't need any big corporation. It needs, companies that can really embrace what we believe through a big corporation that is an all stakeholder approach, where we really try to balance people, profit and planet, right? So it's not just about the shareholders, but it's about all stakeholders and how we can really think in a more holistic way. For us, relationships is very important. We are a company that is really rooted in this notion of direct to customer, direct to consumer. And we actually have over 8 million consultancy representatives that actually make their living and transform their lives by actually working with us among our 4 different brands. As I said, Natura is a Brazilian company. We have deep connections, for example, with the Amazon region, which is key for us. And in that regard, we actually was one of the first company that actually invested in the region, created an industrial facility that not only creates a lot of employment and training, but also really work with the local communities, over 7,000 local communities in the Amazon region, that we can actually prove that it is possible to drive economic development for those families, indigenous population, and at the same time preserving the forest. One of the key challenges that we have capturing our 2030 sustainability vision is how we protect the Amazon region. Our commitment to life, which is our vision for sustainability in 2030, outlined clearly where we needed to invest. Going to your question, we talk about, again, protecting the Amazon and to become net zero in scope 1, 2, and 3. At the same time, how we really embrace a more diverse associate and employment population, and also how we drive full circularity in our products. So we do believe that technology and how we invest resources will be fundamental for us to be able to deliver against those goals. And if you ask us today, we're not sure if you have all the answers, how we're going to get to those goals by 2030, but we're going to need the investments. We're going to need cooperation across multiple stakeholders to make sure that we continue to progress. To close, I want to return to the point about investment and how we needed to make wise use of new technology capabilities that will become available. We have an opportunity to be more intentional about it in terms of how we funnel those resources, in which areas we're going to really create incentives versus subsidies that right now are creating a lot of issues in some areas, for example, like the Amazon again. So how we really, choose wise about investment, use of technology, it becomes, in our opinion, a call to action and an opportunity in a forum like this one to really think very intentional about, deployment and use of resources. So thank you again for the opportunity to be here today.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mr. Marcus, for sharing those perspectives with us. And I think that does kind of reiterate a lot of what Professor Sachs was trying to tell us, which is that it needs to be, there needs to be efforts all around to build what is needed. And so, Professor Sachs, let me come back to you. And then, Mr. Marcus, I might come back to you with another question afterwards, after we've gotten through everybody. Professor Sachs, since you got cut off, I think that you're back on the line.
Yes.
Okay.
And on firm ground.
Okay,
So,
good. That's wonderful. We were just talking about how you were basically saying some investment is government investment, but they don't have the money. So then how do we think about that? So let me give it back to you.
If you do actual investment planning, not rhetoric, but real planning of a real country, you find out that the government needs some revenues. You find out that business needs some investment. And we get past really the cliches that are killing us and are killing development. The IMF has done some good studies in the last 3 years showing that poor countries cannot afford to accomplish the SDGs. They cannot run a health sector. They cannot keep the children in school. They cannot provide safe water to the population. And so we need to do something about this. The rich countries generally don't give a damn, if you'll pardon the expression. They don't, because they don't pay attention. Hundreds of millions of people are hungry right now. Hundreds of millions more became hungry during this pandemic. There is barely a response. And all we hear is, well, there's trillions in the private sector. If only there'd be more deregulation and governments would get out of the way. That's not going to solve the problem of children in school. It's not going to solve the problem of billions of undernourished people. It is not going to solve the problem of basic access to healthcare. It is not going to solve most of the infrastructure problems, despite the blah, 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 if I could use a now famous phrase, that is afflicting us. So I have a basic plea, because UNCTAD is so good and so important. Do the quantification. Look at the investments that are actually needed for the 2030 agenda and for the 2050 agenda. They're specific. They include health. They include education. They include digitalization. They include electrification. They include water and sanitation. They include conservation and land management. And of course, they include business development of various sorts. Quantify what is needed to achieve the SDGs or decarbonization. It's quite an interesting exercise. I've been doing it for 25 years. You will find out that poor countries have a massive financing gap that nobody addresses, and that all the talk of the new World Investment Alliance and so forth, they don't get. They need to understand this. And how are you going to do business development if the kids have no skills, if they haven't been in school, if the graduation rate of upper secondary level is 25%, as it is in most of sub-Saharan Africa? Now, UNCTAD gets all of this. The IMF gets all of this. But unfortunately, we're lost right now because we don't have real solutions to increase financing. What we saw during this pandemic was the rich countries could borrow unlimited amounts at basically zero interest rates. The United States borrows 30 years, fixed term, at 1.6% interest. Try that in Pakistan or Morocco or Egypt or other countries. They'd be paying 8 or 10% interest rates, and they'd have a debt crisis within the next few years. So we need mechanisms to get development finance to developing countries, not business finance. I thought what Prime Minister Khan put forward was excellent. De-risking this kind of sovereign borrowing, for example, but that's what the multilateral development bank should be doing. But why is the total portfolio, if you add up the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and so forth, why is it 100 billion a year rather than $1 trillion a year? Because we're not paying attention. And that's what I would really make the plea in closing. Get serious about the kinds of investments that are needed. Understand that there is a role for private investment, to be sure, but it is a partial role. There is a massive, critical, unmet role for public investment that requires public finance. And it cannot be at junk bond yield terms, which it is right now. And Wall Street, forget it. They know nothing about development, but they talk a lot about the trillions. We need real development financing that gets funding to poor countries to meet the promises that have been made and the commitments that have been made by rich countries never fulfilled in order to achieve our goals. Final point, start with the objectives for 2030 and 2050, work backwards, do it quantitatively, put aside the poetry and the rhetoric, do the numbers. And then I'm sure we're going to come up with solutions, because the truth is, when you do the numbers, we're several $100 billion short. But you know what? We have $100 trillion world economy. So we're within 1% of world GDP per year of the financing we need. An extra trillion, for example, is 1% of world output, but it has to be redirected. And that's not by ease of doing business, excuse me. That is through public financing to enable schools, clinics, health, elimination of hunger, environmental conservation. Thanks a lot. I appreciate the chance to be with you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sachs. And I think, that's a call to arms. And certainly, if I could put it in lay language, it's sort of like saying, let's quantify it so we stop kicking this can down the road and just pretending that the money will suddenly miraculously appear from the private sector. Coming from a development bank background myself. So very exciting to hear all of that. I mean, I think everyone's a little energized right now, and I certainly think you have lots of people on the line who will take very, very much to heart what you just said. Now, with that, and I don't know how much longer you can stay on. I hope that you can stay on. We might come back to you. Okay, great, because I can assume that people will have questions. So let me then quickly turn then to Mr. Berkner. Because, coming from BCG, a top strategy consulting firm, you've been looking at world trends forever. Can you tell us a little bit about, if you want to, please do react to what Professor Sachs was talking about, and also tell us a little bit more about what companies actually can do. And if you can also add to that what they can't do, sort of in line with what we were just hearing. Mr. Berkner.
It's very good to be with you. Thanks for the opportunity. Jeffrey really, put some passion into the discussion, which I really like. But I would also say that, he somehow painted a quite one-sided picture. And of course, for whether it's government or whether it's business, you expect, a certain one-sided picture. I think what is really important, we heard about this, of course, is that it's good cooperation, not just between government and business, but also between civil society, government, and business. I think Rebecca referred at the beginning to finger pointing, and I think, we need to stop pointing fingers. I also would like to emphasize when we talk about business, we're not just talking about multinational corporations coming from North America, Europe, or Asia, but we need to talk about domestic business as well as international or foreign business. We need to talk about SMEs as well as about big corporations. And, they all do help to create jobs, but they also are able and necessary to deliver on the basic human needs that Jeffrey referred to. Human capital, meaning, of course, food, healthcare, education. And we have in quite a number of African countries or in India, for example, companies who are engaging, local companies in education. A lot of this kills the children, even in India, go to private schools, even from very poor families. We have, hospitals, decent hospitals, run by local companies. And we have many companies in the food sector who do support local farmers. So I think, even on the basic stuff, which Jeffrey rightly emphasized, there are a lot of opportunities for both for government investment, but also for private business, local private business, international private business to get involved. And maybe, yes, Wall Street may not be interested, but I wouldn't worry too much about that. I think the same is true, of course, in physical capital infrastructure, logistics. I mean, if there are no good roads and railroads and ports and airports, how can the economy really develop? There needs to be very good digital, infrastructure in order to ensure there's connectivity. But I think it's also very important that we do understand that business can only do a good job creating jobs for the people so that they can take destiny of their own hands, if there is security, and if there is also working institutions, the rule of law. I mean, we've heard this a number of times, and just pouring a lot of money, international money or government money or IMF money into a place is not giving you any economic development. We need really security. We need institutions that work. We need the rule of law so that there is stability and reliability. And that's true for the poor woman and men on the street and on the road and in the villages, as it is true for the small, mid-sized enterprise and the large corporations. Stability and reliability, and then there will be also investments also in small countries. We have seen this in a number of African countries. We've seen it in Botswana. We've seen it in Rwanda. We've seen a number of interesting investments in Kenya and in also parts of West Africa by local investors, by foreign corporations. Because I think one of the key elements is that we're seeing the global supply chains being broken up into regional and local supply chains in order to hedge your bets. There are natural disasters, there are geopolitics, there is digitization, and the need for local adaptation that really requires, to think much more locally and not just globally. And that's why, and it's also not about, one company, one big foreign company producing everything. The moment you start, selling something in a country, producing something in a country, what you need is an ecosystem. There will be many small suppliers, local suppliers, maybe some also additional international suppliers that are needed. I mentioned food companies who need the local farmers. Of course, they also, the big automotive companies need local suppliers to make it work. And all these entities are making investments, but they do make these investments if there is a reasonable return and if there is basic security and stability that is needed. And let me emphasize what I said at the beginning and what has been said also by Borg Brenda. We need cooperation. I think this one-sided approach that Jeffrey has put forward is not sufficient. Of course, we can increase the amounts of money being invested, flowing from international organizations, and if it's not 100 billion, if not enough, then let's do 1 trillion. But if we don't create the basic stability, the basic reliability, the basic functioning of institutions in these countries, and also security, it will not work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And, I think that it's true that if you look in a lot of developing regions, whether it's Africa, developing Asia, et cetera, it's like a young army of social entrepreneurs just waiting to create jobs and businesses, but they need to have the tools. And I think that's where between the two of you, there's clearly, between you and Professor Sachs, there's clearly, sort of room for cooperation because the government has certain things to do, the sine qua non of, I think, security, as you mentioned, but also the responsibility to do those things that we as a society agree to do together. So with that, actually, Professor Sachs, I think if you're still on the line, I need to come back to you just because there's a little bit of a debate going on, and then I'm going to come, Peter Robinson, to you right afterwards. But if I could go to Professor Sachs quickly,
Yeah.
still on the line.
Great. Thank you very much. Look, I don't have a one-sided approach. I have a three-sided approach. There is social investment in basic education, in basic nutrition, and in healthcare. Okay, I've been 40 years working on this. People are suffering by the billions. And what we just heard is just not right. If you don't have adequate public financing, you will leave out half your country or 3/4 of your country. This is so obvious and so true and so real. And if it's right that, if we need 1 trillion, we'll get 1 trillion, then there's no argument. I've been fighting for that trillion for a long time. Where is it? Oh, it's too much. We can't do it, and so forth. So that's one part. The second part is infrastructure, some of which is privately fundable, much of which is not. And the third side is business development. It's not a one-side approach, it's a three-sided approach. And there's a role, it's true. All I'm objecting to is the happy feeling. Yeah, we'll all cooperate, but we're not talking about what we really need to cooperate on, which is this world is coming apart at the seams between the rich and the poor. And we hear the rich always say, well, the poor, it's not just money, but it is for the rich. But the poor do not have access to what they need to stay alive. And they don't have, and we just had the World Food System Summit. We just had the World Food Security Report showing that 3 billion people on this planet cannot afford a healthy diet. When are we going to get serious about the real investment scale? If it's as easy as saying, oh, if you need $1 trillion, we'll do $1 trillion, then we're all set. Then there is no argument anymore. But that's what I'm talking about. And I've been talking about for years, which is we need massively to scale up development financing. You cannot have a healthy business sector. You cannot have social stability with mass hunger, in illiterate population, children not in school. It can't be done. And so if you want order, if you want stability, if you want long-term business investment, you need productive workers. They need to have an education. They need to be healthy. We need to go to the basics of development, and we need some CEOs to learn some development also, because all the CEOs see is their own niche, or all the bond sellers see is sovereign bonds with different credit ratings. And this is not doing the job, actually. We need a development finance strategy that is three-sided, not one-sided.
Terrific, thanks. And actually, I'm going to let the others respond if they'd like as well. But I mean, from one development economist to another, you can't say that of those three sides, only infrastructure is investable by the private sector, right? I mean, even if you think about water and sanitation in rich countries, this is big business. And it's just not right now in developing countries. So I think we also have to be a little bit nuanced, particularly given that there's lots of business opportunities and jobs to be created there. Just to give, you know, a little bit of a balance here. I have to defend everyone. Sorry, what were you saying?
That we know that half the world is not on the internet right now. But actually, internet access is about 90% from a physical point of view, but half the world can't afford access. So unless we have a serious plan, it's not enough to say, well, that's a private infrastructure issue. This is an issue about poverty. This is an issue which requires budgets. This is an issue which requires attention to the fact that you can have infrastructure there, but it will not be accessible to half or more of the population unless there is a government policy that enables that. And that requires public financing, not just market financing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Point well taken. And I think, you know, so we really need to map out as a whole, as a society, how we're going to do all of this together. So let me actually quickly first go to Peter Robinson, and then Mr. Berkner, I might come back to you again afterwards. But I mean, so again, getting kind of really specific about the sorts of things that are needed. You spoke about the need to defend a rules-based trade and investment system when you were speaking just earlier, including the investor-state dispute settlement system that safeguards investor rights. Could you please provide a little more detail on what actually needs to be defended from an investor perspective with respect to the current arbitration system in international investment agreements? Because this is really concretely something that might help us to move forward. Thank you.
Sure. But just if I could just start off with, I mean, I think this is a great discussion, and I agree that, you know, we're facing an urgent situation. There are no easy answers. We need and we can be doing a lot more, and we need serious plans, and we need to be working together. And I don't think that's just rhetoric. I mean, I believe it. We're an organization, for example, that really does work very closely with other social partners in collaboration, and we need governments, business, and social partners working together to maximize what each can bring to the table. In terms of the investor-state dispute settlement area, yeah, well, what I was referring to was that there have been questions raised by state defendants and civil society regarding the arbitrational functions provided in international investment agreements. We agree that the investor-state dispute settlement needs fine-tuning, including the increasing cost and duration of disputes. But we also need to be careful not to undermine a carefully balanced arbitration system featuring appropriate and equal roles for the two parties to the dispute that's established under current ISDS processes. Investors value ISDS as a tool that guarantees neutral third-party dispute resolution to ensure that investors and states both honor the terms of their agreements. Otherwise, we risk creating a chill for investors during a time when obviously we're talking about the world is in desperate need of FDI to support recovery and sustainable growth, along with public financing and everything else. These issues, as I mentioned before, are under discussion in Working Group 3 of the UN Commission on International Trade Law, which brings together a group of diplomats with considerable expertise who are carefully deliberating to ensure changes are fair and equitable and safeguard the balance between investor and state. And we also welcome the OECD's new work stream on the future of investment treaties, which we believe will also contribute to the dialogue.
Excellent, thanks a lot. So I think those are some sort of marching orders in terms of things that need to happen for the flows to flow properly. And then after that, we have to make sure that they flow to the right places. If I could quickly now turn to Roberto Marcus again, and especially given this sort of dichotomy that we've had developed now between public and private, can you tell us a little bit more about what the private sector needs from governments and the international community really to invest in sustainable businesses, and what specifically is missing?
Yeah, so listen, I think, Professor, Jeff brings a good point to which I completely agree in terms of clear metrics and mapping what needs to happen, right? So again, from our perspective, we created a clear set of metrics that we need to achieve as a company by 2030, right? With 30 KPIs, using science-based targets and kind of working backwards what we needed to achieve, year by year. And we are holding people accountable in terms of their remuneration, how they make money. I think it would be important for governments to partner and also establish a clear metrics, what we needed to achieve in public education and in terms of, again, I'm going to use the Amazon region, which is very important to us and very important for the globe, for the planet, not only for Brazil and for Latin America. What needs to happen to regenerate, to preserve the forest? So if the partnership between private sector, government, civil society, if we can agree and converge what needs to happen for us in those specific terms, and then working backwards with clear metrics, I think the conversation becomes less speculative, it becomes less theoretical, and becomes really factual based, data driven based. So for me, I think that is the first step. Let's be intentional about it. Let's again collaborate. I don't think it is just a private sector or public. I think it is a all stakeholder approach, but we needed to put the key stakeholders in one room, and then in specific areas, like for example, the Amazon region, what we needed to do collectively, and then again, map that out by 2030. This is what needs to happen by 2050. And then we can discuss funding. What is the funding that will have to happen through public sector, and what are the things that can be complemented and done by the private sector? So I think becoming more intentional, becoming more clear about a roadmap, and then also holding people accountable, right? Which is also something that I find interesting, that again, there is lack of clarity about specifically how we're going to really get those things done, right? For me, I would say that is probably the first and important step, because that clarity, in my opinion, will create more convergency and will enable civil society to actually hold people accountable. If you're in a company as an executive, you are in the government in terms of elections and everything else. So anyway, that for me is the first step, which I believe it is a all stakeholder collectively, public sector, private sector, civil society together, but with clarity about mapping out data-driven and holding people accountable.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that. I think that that does give us a good sense of sort of the landscape. And, I'd like to turn back to Mr. Berkner, maybe for your thoughts as well, sort of maybe stepping back and thinking, all this talk of planning and what's needed to plan out things in terms of global cooperation. What would you say are the most important next steps?
Yeah, I'm really glad that Jeffrey put really passion and some controversy in the discussion. Otherwise, we are all in agreement and it's easy. But I think one of the things, I would like to emphasize, the Boston Consulting Group, our company, has worked on food, on health, on education, on basic needs, on sustainability in many of the emerging markets with governments and with business. And so there is not just one big solution government. I think what we need is country by country, that the different objectives are being defined and quantified, rightly so. And then, people really take responsibility and push things forward. It's not, one size fits all. And I'm sure, if we just throw a lot of money at it, it will not work, because the situation country by country is very different. Yes, many children are suffering, as Jeffrey has emphasized, but I think we can only help them get a good education, get good health, have enough to eat, if we are able to make sure that people can really build, small businesses in their country, local companies, but also foreign investors. And I think, it needs a really differentiated discussion country by country and also sector by sector to make it work. And the blanket big numbers will not help. And of course, also business has a responsibility. Jennifer, you asked earlier about this. What is responsibility? Also, businesses need to engage and help make these objectives, whether it's for helping in education, helping in health, make it work. And I think many companies, whether it's in India, in Africa, in Latin America, many of the companies, and Roberta has mentioned it, for Brazil, are really engaged. And it needs good cooperation with clear objectives and clear accountabilities.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I would like to just stay with you, and then I'm going to go to each of the speakers because we're getting to the end of the discussion. If you could just let me know, if you have any very last thoughts, and I think in particular, and I'm going to come to everybody, all and in the opposite order that I came to you in the first place, for fairness. What do you think the role of the World Investment Forum plays in this? What really is the utility of this discussion and this forum here? And any last words? So, Mr. Berkner, any thoughts that you have?
I would say it's really transparency, dialogue, and then defining clear objectives, as has been emphasized before. And I think if we get this done, year by year, we'll make good progress in the coming decade.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much. Now I'd like to go to Mr. Marcus. Any final thoughts, and especially, World Investment Forum and all of this?
No, I agree with Hans Paul in terms of clarity of goals. Defining this again. Walking backwards. I also agree with Professor Jeff. Let's be very tangible. Let's be very specific. Again, science-based targets. What needs to be done in terms of sustainability? What needs to be done in terms of education? What needs to be done in terms of infrastructure? If we can have that clarity in terms of where we need to get to by 2030, by 2040, by 2050, and then really working backwards, but in partnership between what's the role of government, what's the role of private sector, what's the role of civil society, how to engage civil society in the solution. I always tell that customers or consumers, before they're customers and consumers, they are citizens, right? And they want to engage, they want to participate. How we bring them as part of the solution as well. I mentioned the example of the Amazon. and how it's important to work with the local communities as part of the solution for the forest. The solution is not going to come just from the outside, either public or private. It's really engaging with the local community. So a more inclusive approach with clear metrics and then holding people accountable. That's what I would expect. And I think this forum can actually help us a lot into that.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. I think that's pretty concrete. And it does link a lot to what Professor Sachs was saying. So Professor Sachs, if I could turn back to you in 1 minute. What are your thoughts on, really anything you want to leave us with, and also how this particular forum can be helpful?
Thank you very much.
UNCTAD is listening, so.
Great, thank you. We have the goals. It is the SDGs for 2030. It is the Paris Agreement for 2050, and it will be the agreements reached at COP15 on the Convention on Biodiversity. We should do the country analysis, but Mr. Bruckner should understand that when the country analysis is done now and the large financing gaps are exposed, they are not closed because there is no systemic way to close them. Countries have their allocations under IDA. They have their allocations under bilateral aid. The flows are grossly insufficient by hundreds of billions of dollars per year. The IMF is the first one to say this. This is a systemic issue, not a country-by-country issue, though, of course, the analysis needs to be done at the country level. But then we need a system that responds to that analysis, which we do not have. Final word, I'm looking forward to meeting with Peter Robinson to talk about ISDS, the Investor State Dispute Settlement. It is largely a scam operation right now, I'm sorry to say. In the case of Pakistan, one investor that didn't even break ground got a settlement of almost $10 billion for profits that they would have made over 40 years if the project had taken place, even though the Pakistan Supreme Court said that the original contract was illegal, contrary to law of the country, but the investor state dispute settlement just handed it to the multinationals. I'm sure that Mr. Robinson knows that there's actually a syndication operation for these ISDS cases. It's a market on Wall Street. It is a game and a scam. So I'm glad to hear that it's going to be reformed. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot for that. I was waiting to see what you were going to say. Mr. Robinson, I'm going to turn to you now because it's only fair. I mean, we all have heard of that case. So if you can respond to that as well as afterwards sort of tag on any of your final thoughts and how this particular forum can be helpful moving forward. Mr. Robinson.
Well, listen, I think in general, we do need an investor state dispute settlement system that works. And I agree that we do need to improve it. I don't think there's any question about that. And that's what the discussions currently underway are trying to do. I think when I first became aware of UNCTAD many years ago, there was a good deal of divide in the north-south between multilateral organizations and business. I think UNCTAD over the years has emerged as an organization that brings people together. I think the role of the World Investment Forum and UNCTAD has increased in value. And I think the important thing about the World Investment Forum is that it is a place that brings key stakeholders together, governments, private sector, civil society, to look at the issues and to move forward from rhetoric to action. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I want to thank all of you for what has been a truly fantastic, very energetic discussion that has covered a lot of ground. And so what I'm going to do is just turn to summarizing a bit the discussion from what has been a really rich day and also propose just a few key takeaways since it would be impossible to sort of capture everything. Overall, I think we've heard over and over about how important global investment can be as an engine driving us towards a more inclusive and sustainable future, particularly if significant resources flow into financing the SDGs, also the investments around COP, and to the places where investment is most needed. And this is increasingly urgent. I mean, we've heard this call to arms. We have less than a decade to go, and soon only 8 years to go to 2030. And there is still so much to achieve, and there's a huge capital shortfall. So we need to work together to change this. Now, in order to fully benefit from international trade and investment, we've heard about the things that emerging economies need to do. We heard a lot about things that advanced economies need to do, and things that they need to do together. And all of our speakers have really stressed the importance of regional integration to develop economies of scale, as well as developing greater South-South trade, South-South cooperation in general, and the importance of ensuring conducive business environments, but also just crowding a lot more financing into development in those places that need it the most. Finally, we've heard a lot about the importance of focusing on job-creating sectors, as well as sustainable infrastructure. And on that, I'm talking both human capital infrastructure as well as hard infrastructure. Businesses as well as governments have clear roles to play in ensuring that economies around the world fully benefit from the opportunities of this technological innovation that we're experiencing, as well as the very rapidly changing international production landscape. We've seen so much happen just over the last couple of years. As we build back better, let us build together the inclusive and sustainable future that we and future generations really both need and deserve. I would like to thank everyone for your attention. And with this, I formally close the Global Leaders Investment Summit of the World Investment Forum and wish all of you an excellent continuation of your day and a great week ahead. Thank you.